The air was a palpable, metallic groan, a symphony of tortured steel and something far worse. It clung to the back of the throat, thick with the tang of ozone, stale blood, and a chemical burn that never truly left the lungs. His breath hitched, a ragged sound lost in the cacophony of the chamber. The single, flickering bulb above cast long, dancing shadows, distorting the already impossible shapes within. A sound, like tearing canvas, echoed from the far wall. Not fabric. Flesh. He knew it with a sickening certainty that curdled his stomach. His eyes, though watering from the acrid fumes, strained to pierce the gloom. There, slumped against the reinforced partition, was a figure. Or what remained of one. It twitched, a spasmodic jerking, as if an invisible puppeteer tugged at severed strings. The skin, where it existed, was stretched taut, thin as parchment, revealing the grotesque topography of muscle and sinew beneath. Its mouth, a mangled cavern, opened slowly, wider than any human jaw should allow, and from it issued not a scream, but a wet, rasping wheeze, a sound of profound and ancient hunger. He felt the tremors in the floorboards beneath his heavy boots, not from the structure, but from a deeper, more primal vibration. The others. They were moving. Scrabbling. He could hear their nails, or what used to be nails, against the metal floor. A low, rhythmic thumping began, growing louder, closer. It was a heart. No, multiple hearts, beating in unison, yet out of time, a horrifying counterpoint to the wheezing man. A voice, not his own, but a dry, brittle whisper from beside him, spoke, "They want to stay awake. They cannot sleep." The words were meaningless, drowned out by the rising tide of internal screams, yet they hammered at his mind, leaving a lasting, indelible impression of terror. He wanted to turn away, to shut his eyes, to tear them from his skull, but a morbid fascination, a paralyzing dread, held him captive. The figure against the wall, its head lolling unnaturally, began to tear at its own chest, not with desperation, but with a horrifying, methodical precision. A wet ripping sound, then a gurgle. He felt something hot splash his cheek, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was not sweat. The shudder that racked Elias Thorne's frame was so violent it nearly dislodged his spectacles. He gasped, the stale air of his study filling his lungs, a stark contrast to the phantom stench that had assailed him moments before. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the quiet hum of his ancient desktop computer. He blinked, the grainy image on the screen wavering before his eyes, its black characters dancing like malevolent sprites. It was always like this after a deep dive, a plunge into the festering depths of forgotten history. The cold, creeping tendrils of the past reaching out, grasping. Elias pushed himself back from the desk, the worn leather of his chair groaning in protest. He ran a hand through his perpetually disheveled dark hair, a habit born of countless hours spent hunched over obscure texts and flickering monitors. The taste of copper lingered on his tongue, a phantom echo. The copper taste, a metallic ghost, faded as Elias's breath steadied. He pushed himself further back, the worn leather of his chair groaning in protest, a sound as familiar as his own heartbeat. The study, his sanctuary and his prison, seemed to breathe around him. It was a cavern of forgotten lore, its walls lined with towering bookshelves crammed with texts whose spines had cracked with age, their pages brittle as autumn leaves. Ancient maps, their edges curled and faded, lay beneath stacks of yellowed newspapers and unbound manuscripts, a testament to decades of relentless pursuit. Dust motes, like tiny, unseen spirits, danced in the solitary shaft of weak afternoon light that dared to pierce the grimy windowpane. His routine was a ritual, a monastic devotion to the shadows of the past. He would rise with the pale dawn, or more often, long after it, the world outside a distant, irrelevant hum. A mug of bitter, black coffee, cold and forgotten from the previous night, would be his first communion, chased by a dry biscuit or a piece of stale bread, devoured without thought. The real sustenance came from the flickering screen, the endless archives, the whispered histories. He lived in the digital gloom and the musty scent of decaying paper, his body a mere vessel for the insatiable hunger of his intellect. Elias ran a hand through his perpetually disheveled dark hair, a habit born of countless hours spent hunched over obscure texts and flickering monitors. His spectacles, perched precariously on his nose, reflected the faint glow of the screen, miniature windows into his obsessive world. His clothes, loose and comfortable, bore the faint scent of old paper and lukewarm coffee. The house itself, an ancient structure of dark wood and creaking floorboards, stood silent around him, a sleeping giant disturbed only by the rhythmic tapping of his keyboard and the occasional sigh of shifting foundations. No neighbors disturbed his peace, no social obligations intruded upon his solitary quest. He preferred it that way. The living were too loud, too insistent, the dead, however, were perfect companions, their tales waiting patiently for him to unearth them. He leaned forward again, the phantom sensation of wet cold still clinging to his memory. The image on the screen, a chilling depiction of a man's final, desperate act, had receded, replaced by the familiar interface of his research database. He typed, his fingers flying across the keys, searching for keywords that might illuminate the dreadful vision: psychological warfare, deprivation, unconventional interrogation, Soviet-era experiments. He sifted through declassified documents, old scientific papers, and fragmented forum discussions, a digital archaeologist digging through layers of forgotten data. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the deepening shadows outside his window and the growing ache in his shoulders. The world outside his study faded into an indistinct blur. He was a diver in the deep ocean, the pressure of the past pressing in on him, the surface a distant, shimmering memory. He chased threads, followed footnotes, cross-referenced obscure references, each click of the mouse a step deeper into the labyrinth. It was late, the old house groaning around him in the profound silence of the night, when a peculiar entry caught his eye. Buried deep within a digitized archive of Cold War-era psychological studies, a file labeled Project Nightingale, Phase 3 Anomalies, appeared. The title itself was an anomaly, standing out amongst the more clinical designations of its brethren. The document was heavily redacted, large swathes of text obscured by black bars, but a few phrases remained visible, like jagged teeth in a shadowed maw: sleep cycle disruption, prolonged wakefulness, subjects exhibiting extreme paranoia and self-destructive tendencies, containment protocols breached, location classified, northern region. A tremor, subtle yet insistent, snaked through Elias. Nightingale. The name, usually associated with something beautiful and melodic, here hummed with an unsettling discord. The keywords, the location, the chilling implications of self-destructive tendencies and containment protocols breached, they resonated with the raw, visceral terror he had just experienced. It was a whisper from the past, a faint, cold breath on the back of his neck, hinting at a truth far more disturbing than any fiction. He felt the familiar pull, the irresistible gravitational force of a story begging to be told, a secret demanding to be unearthed. This was it. This was the thread. And with a grim resolve, Elias Thorne prepared to follow it into the darkness. The chamber's metallic walls shimmered with a constant, unforgiving cold. Frost bloomed in delicate, lethal patterns along the edges of the thick steel door, a silent testament to the frigid northern expanse outside. Inside, the air hummed with the barely audible hiss of the stimulant gas, an invisible, insidious current that permeated every breath, every thought. 5 men, each a ghost of his former self, paced or sat, their eyes wide, too wide, tracking phantom movements in the unchanging gloom. Days bled into nights without the mercy of darkness. The gas, a cruel master, forbade the sweet release of slumber. At first, it had been a novelty, a strange clarity of mind. They spoke, they argued, their voices growing hoarse from the incessant chatter, a desperate attempt to fill the suffocating silence. But as the third day clawed its way past, a new silence began to creep in, more terrifying than any noise. It was the silence of their own minds, stretched thin, fraying at the edges. Then came the sound. It began subtly, a faint, rhythmic scrape. Leonid, the youngest, a man whose hands had once been stained with the blood of others, was the first to notice. He stopped his pacing, head cocked, eyes darting. "Did you hear that?" His voice, usually a low growl, was a strained whisper. The others, their senses already unnaturally sharpened by the gas, paused. 4 pairs of bloodshot eyes focused on him. "Hear what, boy?" muttered Grigory, the oldest, his face a roadmap of hard living, now etched with a deeper weariness. "That, scraping. Like something dragging." For a long moment, there was nothing but the steady, soft hiss of the gas and the frantic thumping of their own hearts. Then, it returned. Scrape. 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 Fainter than a shadow, yet undeniably present. It seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the impenetrable steel that was their prison. "It's nothing," Nikolai, the former engineer, declared, though his eyes betrayed his conviction, scanning the seamless joints of the chamber. The pipes, settling. The cold. But the sound persisted, growing in intensity, shedding its mechanical guise. It wasn't the groan of metal or the settling of ice. It was organic. A slow, deliberate drag, followed by a softer thump, then another drag. As if something impossibly heavy was being pulled across an abrasive surface, then dropped. And then again. Panic, a cold, sharp blade, began to pierce through the stimulant-induced clarity. They were sealed. Absolutely. No rats, no settling pipes could produce such a sound, not with such chilling regularity. The chamber was a tomb. And yet, this sound was alive. Mikhail, the quietest, a man whose past was a closed book even to his fellow condemned, pressed his ear against the cold steel wall. His breath hitched. He pulled back, his face pale, lips trembling. "It's inside the wall," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Something is moving. Something, big." The sound intensified, drawing closer, or so it seemed, to where they huddled. It was no longer a scrape and a thump. Now, it was accompanied by a soft, wet squelch, like something heavy and pulpy being compressed. A sickening rhythm began to assert itself, a cadence of obscene movement. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on the steel. They knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that no living thing of their world could make such a sound, not in this sealed, desolate place. The cold in the chamber deepened, a metaphysical chill, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for the source of the impossible sound to reveal itself. The gas continued its hiss, a mocking lullaby to their burgeoning terror, as the unseen thing in the walls continued its slow, wet, dragging progress. And with each horrifying squelch, the thin veil between reality and the unimaginable began to tear. The air in the chamber had grown impossibly heavy, thick with the scent of their own fear and the relentless, sweetish tang of the gas. The 5 men, now truly a single, trembling entity of dread, stood rooted, their breath catching in ragged gasps. The squelch and drag continued, a morbid, rhythmic pulse from within the very fabric of their confinement. "It's the gas," rasped one, a burly man named Vasily, his voice a strained whisper, though he tried to imbue it with a semblance of authority. "It plays tricks on the mind. Hallucinations. Sensory distortion. They told us it would affect our perception." His eyes, however, darted wildly, betraying the fragile conviction in his words. Another, Yuri, a sharp-featured man known for his quick wit and cynical outlook, scoffed, a sound devoid of humor. "Hallucinations? All five of us? Hearing the same wet, grinding slither? Are we to believe this chamber is built of lies and phantoms, Vasily?" He pressed his own ear against a different section of the steel wall, his brow furrowed in a desperate attempt to find a logical fault, a structural weakness, a vibration that could be misinterpreted. The cold steel transmitted only the impossible. The sound was not merely through the wall, it felt as though it originated within it, or perhaps the wall itself was merely a thin membrane separating them from some colossal, unseen organism. Yuri pulled back, his face a mask of disbelief. "There's no mechanism for it. No pipes, no conduits that could carry such a sound. And it's moving around us. A circuit." The quietest man, Nikolai, who had first sensed the presence, now spoke, his voice barely a breath. "It started small. A tapping. A scrape. Like something trying to find its way. Now it's found a path." He gestured vaguely at the seamless steel, as if tracing an invisible tunnel. Vasily, desperate to cling to sanity, pointed a trembling finger at the ventilation grills set high on the walls. "Rats. Big ones. Or some kind of burrowing creature. They get into the vents, the ducts. The sound carries." But the others shook their heads, their eyes glazed with a deeper understanding. "No rat," Yuri murmured, "makes a sound like a sack of wet meat dragging itself through mud. And the walls are solid, steel plate, sealed. No ducts within the structural walls. Only the air intakes." He gestured to the floor vents. "And that sound, it's heavy. Too heavy for anything that could exist in a wall cavity." Nikolai, his gaze fixed on nothing, began to rock gently. "My grandmother, she used to tell stories. Old stories, from the deep north. Of the ones who sleep beneath the ice. The living earth, she called them. Things that stir when the world forgets them, when the balance is broken. Things that feed on despair. On fear." His voice faded, a distant echo. "They were said to awaken in places of great suffering, where the living were left to rot." A profound silence descended, broken only by the relentless squelch. The men looked at Nikolai, then at each other, a terrible, unspoken understanding passing between them. The initial flicker of rationalization had been extinguished, replaced by a primal dread. Vasily's face, once resolute, was now pale and slick with sweat. He no longer attempted to explain. Yuri's cynical wit had dissolved into wide-eyed horror. They were not merely trapped in a chamber, they were trapped with something ancient, something that defied the laws of their world, something that was now, unmistakably, aware of them. The gas, once a weapon of mind alteration, now seemed a mere accessory to a greater terror. The cold chamber, designed to hold them, now felt like a cage built for something else entirely, something that was slowly, wetly, moving through its unseen passages, a predatory presence stirring from a long, forgotten sleep. And they, the condemned, were merely the first offerings. The profound silence that had swallowed Nikolai's dreadful pronouncements now began to press down, thick and suffocating. It was not the silence of peace, but of a predator's careful, patient vigil. The air, already heavy with the insidious, sleep-robbing gas, grew colder, a bone-deep chill that seemed to emanate not from the chamber's walls, but from something deeper, something ancient stirring within its unseen passages. The squelch. It was no longer a distant, unsettling echo. It was closer, sickeningly intimate, a wet, dragging sound that seemed to scrape against the very fabric of their sanity. It moved, sometimes from the shadowed corners, sometimes seeming to originate from directly beneath their makeshift cots. Vasily, his breath coming in ragged gasps, pressed himself against the cold metal, his eyes darting wildly. Yuri, once a man of sharp wit, now whimpered softly, his gaze fixed on nothing, his face a mask of utter horror. The gas, a cruel trick of their captors, continued its work. There was no escape into the blessed oblivion of unconsciousness. Every nerve ending was alight, every fear amplified 1,000-fold by the relentless onslaught of wakefulness. Their minds, denied respite, began to unravel, tearing at the edges of reality. Shadows, once mere illusions cast by the dim overhead bulb, now seemed to possess a life of their own. They stretched, writhed, and coalesced into indistinct forms at the periphery of their vision. Vasily swore he saw a gaunt, elongated hand, impossibly thin, reach out from a patch of darkness, only to vanish when he blinked. He rubbed at his eyes, convinced the gas was playing tricks, but the spectral figures persisted, mocking his attempts at rationalization. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, a dry, rustling sound like dead leaves skittering across forgotten graves. They coalesced into fractured words, not spoken aloud, but invading their thoughts, burrowing into the deepest recesses of their fears. Words of despair, of hopelessness, promises of unending torment. They were tailored to each man, picking at their individual regrets and darkest secrets, twisting them into monstrous accusations. "You are worthless," a sibilant voice hissed inside Vasily's skull, echoing his father's final, condemning words. "You deserve this," another whispered to Yuri, dredging up a forgotten act of betrayal from his youth. The men began to turn on each other, their frayed nerves snapping. "Stop it!" Vasily screamed, clutching his head. "Stop whispering. I'm not saying anything." Yuri shrieked back, his eyes wide with terror. "It's you. You're doing this." Nikolai, slumped against the wall, merely watched them with hollow eyes, a grim understanding etched upon his features. He had warned them. The squelch stopped again. A new sound emerged from the darkness, a sound that froze the blood in their veins, a wet, guttural breathing, impossibly close. It was not human. It was deep, ragged, and pulsed with a predatory hunger. Then, a cold, slimy touch brushed against Vasily's ankle, lingering for a horrifying moment before a gentle, insistent tug pulled at his leg. He cried out, a raw, animal sound of pure terror, scrambling backward until his head slammed against the wall. His eyes, wide with disbelief and horror, darted down to his leg. Nothing was visible, yet the sensation, the undeniable, physical contact, remained. The single bulb overhead flickered violently, plunging the chamber into near darkness, the only illumination the sickly, shifting glow of the emergency lights. In the gloom, the other men writhed and clawed at their own skin, driven by unseen torments. One man, his face contorted into a silent scream, began to tear at his fingernails, convinced unseen insects were burrowing beneath them. The cold, wet breathing intensified, no longer just a sound, but a palpable presence, pressing in from all sides. The chamber, once a mere room, now felt like the very maw of a living, hungry beast, slowly closing around its prey. And the entity within, no longer content with whispers and shadows, had begun to taste their fear. Vasily's head still throbbed from the impact, but the pain was a distant echo compared to the icy tendrils of dread coiling in his gut. The cold, wet breathing intensified, no longer just a sound, but a palpable presence, pressing in from all sides. He scrambled backward, away from the unseen assailant, away from the spot where its slimy touch had lingered. His eyes, wide with disbelief and horror, darted around the flickering gloom. The other men writhed and clawed at their own skin, driven by unseen torments, their silent screams a symphony of pure, raw agony. He had to get away from them, away from it. Through the sickly glow of the emergency lights, past the flailing, bloodied forms, a deeper shadow beckoned. In the furthest corner, where the light seemed to surrender completely, there appeared to be a void, a small, dark recess in the concrete wall. It offered a desperate promise, a fleeting illusion of concealment, a place where he might melt into the blackness and become invisible. He clung to this sliver of hope with the ferocity of a drowning man. He crawled, ignoring the rising stench of blood and sweat, the desperate moans of his companions. Each movement was a struggle, his muscles protesting, but the primal urge to hide, to escape the immediate, suffocating terror, propelled him forward. He pushed past a man tearing at his own face, past another who clawed at his chest with frantic, bloody hands. The air grew thicker, heavier, but the deeper shadow remained, a beacon in the madness. Finally, he reached it. It wasn't a recess, not truly, but the play of light and shadow created a convincing illusion. Yet, here, the oppressive wetness seemed less pronounced, the sounds of the other men's anguish slightly muted. A tiny, fleeting whisper of peace brushed against his frayed nerves. He pressed himself into the corner, striving to become one with the darkness, to disappear. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the reality, to find a moment of mental refuge, a brief respite from the relentless torment. The relief was a cruel, ephemeral lie. The coolness he had perceived turned to an unnatural chill that seeped into his bones, colder than any frostbitten northern night. The muffled sounds clarified, revealing themselves not as distant cries, but as closer whispers, slithering, guttural syllables that coiled directly into his ears, each one a tendril of poison, burrowing deep. They were not words in any tongue he knew, yet their meaning unfurled within his mind with terrifying clarity. Images, raw and visceral, erupted behind his eyelids, forcing them open. The darkness of his corner was no longer a refuge, but a canvas for spectral horrors. He saw, not with his eyes, but with a dread, inner sight, the true genesis of this abomination. It was not merely a military trial, a crude experiment in endurance. No, the roots ran deeper, colder, into the very permafrost of this desolate land. The gas, the stimulant, was never just meant to keep men awake. That was the lie. Its true purpose, its cursed design, was to dissolve the fragile membrane between the waking mind and something ancient, something that had slumbered beneath the earth for eons, a consciousness of perpetual, agonizing wakefulness. The whispers coalesced into a chorus of the damned, not just the men in this chamber, but countless others, stretching back through generations. He saw the first unwitting subjects, not soldiers, but prisoners of a forgotten time, forced into crude pits, fed foul concoctions, their screams echoing against primordial stone. He saw the slow, dawning horror in the eyes of the earliest researchers, not the clean-cut military doctors, but wild-eyed shamans, driven by a perverse desire to tap into the truth of existence, to unlock the ultimate vigilance, to never sleep again. They sought power, they sought insight, and instead, they found a gateway to a realm of pure, unadulterated torment. This land, this frostbitten expanse, was not merely isolated, it was a prison for something vast and terrible, something that had been denied rest since the dawn of time. And the gas, refined over centuries, was the key. It didn't stimulate, it opened. It didn't prevent sleep, it destroyed the very concept of peace, of oblivion. It ripped away the mind's natural defenses, flaying the soul bare, exposing it to the ceaseless, agonizing awareness of everything, every atom vibrating, every breath drawn, every sound, every thought, forever, without end. The chamber itself seemed to shrink, its walls pressing inward, not physically, but psychically. His lungs burned, not from lack of air, but from the unbearable weight of this revelation. The truth was a physical entity, suffocating him, crushing him. The screams of the other men were not merely sounds of madness, they were echoes of the ancient, unending agony that now flowed freely into their minds, into his own. He clawed at his head, not in an attempt to escape the pain, but to create an exit, an escape hatch for the torrent of consciousness that threatened to drown him. The blood that welled beneath his fingernails felt alien, a warm, wet betrayal against his skin. He was not just a man in a cell, he was a conduit, a vessel for an ancient curse, a sacrifice offered to a wakefulness that predated humanity. The legend wasn't just a story of men driven mad by sleeplessness, it was a chronicle of a primal entity, yearning for release, now finally finding its way into the world through the fractured minds of men. And he was next. The whispers now sang his name, a promise of eternal, agonizing awareness, a perpetual waking nightmare from which there would be no escape, no slumber, ever again. Desperation surged, a burning tide, but there was nowhere to run, no darkness deep enough, no silence vast enough to hide from the relentless, invading truth. His own skull felt like a cage, his mind the captive, and the ancient terror, the eternal wakefulness, its merciless warden. The whispers were no longer a distant chorus, they were a thunderous roar inside his own skull, each syllable a shard of ice driven deep into his awareness. The chamber, once a mere physical confinement, now felt like a living trap, its walls pressing inward, not on his flesh, but on the very essence of his being. The promised eternal wakefulness arrived not as a gradual descent into sleeplessness, but as a sudden, blinding detonation of consciousness. Every nerve ending screamed, not with pain, but with an agonizing clarity, a hyper-awareness of every fiber, every blood vessel, every microscopic tremor within his own body. There was no filter, no respite, no merciful dulling of sensation. He thrashed, a desperate, flailing marionette, his limbs jerking beyond his command. His eyes, forced wide, saw not the dim, flickering light of the single bulb, but a kaleidoscope of searing white and suffocating black, the boundaries of his vision dissolving into an unbearable, pulsating energy. The sounds, his own ragged breath, the frantic thump of his heart against his ribs, the distant, impossible echoes of the other men's silent screams, converged into a singular, deafening cacophony that stripped away all coherence. It was the sound of existence itself, unedited, unending, and utterly monstrous. The entity was not a thing to be seen, but to be experienced. It was the absolute absence of oblivion, the primal terror of perpetual awareness. It surged into him, a cold, vast ocean of ancient consciousness, not drowning him, but filling him, displacing his own mind with its boundless, relentless truth. He was a fragile glass, and it was the infinite sea, shattering him from within. He clawed at his face, at his throat, at the hard floor beneath him, not to escape a physical prison, but to escape the tyranny of his own senses, to find a sliver of darkness, a momentary lapse of thought, a single breath of nothingness. But there was none. His mind, once a sanctuary, was now a battleground. He fought back with a primal, animalistic ferocity, trying to clench his thoughts, to force his eyes shut, to command his body into stillness, into the blessed void of unconsciousness. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore his throat, a sound that was instantly absorbed and amplified by the invading entity, twisted into a mocking echo. "There is no sleep here, the presence boomed, not in words, but in a crushing wave of undeniable knowing. There is only the waking, the endless, the true. The cold that had clung to the chamber now seeped into his very marrow, not as a physical chill, but as the chilling indifference of pure, unfeeling awareness. He felt himself unraveling, his identity shredding into countless fragments, each piece still agonizingly, perfectly aware. He was no longer a man, but a collection of raw sensations, a vessel for an ancient, merciless vigil. The terror peaked as he understood, this wasn't an escape attempt from a monster, but a desperate, futile struggle against the very nature of existence as defined by a force that predated all life, all thought, all dreams. He was trapped in the glare of its eternal eye, and there would be no closing, no turning away, ever again. His body convulsed one last time, a final, desperate plea for release, before settling into a trembling, agonizing stillness, every fiber screaming, every thought ablazing, unending torment. He was awake. He was utterly, eternally awake. The monitors had gone dark, one by one. Not with a sputter or a fault, but a deliberate, chilling cessation of signal. The vital signs, the brainwave patterns, even the simple ambient sounds within the chamber, all had simply ceased. For 3 days, a profound, unnatural silence had emanated from behind the reinforced steel door, a silence far more terrifying than any scream. Dr. Volkov, his face a mask of strained composure, stared at the blank screens, the cold sweat clinging to his temples. General Kuznetsov, a man forged in the fires of war, paced the sterile observation room, his heavy boots echoing the growing dread in their hearts. "Open it," Kuznetsov finally rasped, the words thick with a terrible finality. "We must see what remains." The heavy bolts groaned as the access hatch was unsealed, a sound like a tomb giving up its dead. A wave of air, thick and metallic, carrying a scent beyond description, a blend of decay, ozone, and something ancient, utterly alien, washed over them. The researchers recoiled, their stomachs lurching. Inside, the horror defied all human comprehension. The chamber was a slaughterhouse, but not of flesh and bone alone. It was a desecration of the very concept of being. The 4 remaining subjects were not merely dead, they were unmade. Their bodies, impossibly gaunt, were twisted into grotesque parodies of human form, skin flayed in intricate, self-inflicted patterns, muscle tissue exposed and shredded. Yet, the most terrifying aspect was their eyes. Wide, unblinking, fixed in an expression of unending, agonizing awareness. There was no relief of death in those vacant depths, only the searing, eternal glare of something too vast to comprehend, too merciless to escape. One man, Nikolai, was slumped against a wall, his abdomen ripped open, entrails meticulously arranged around him like a macabre offering. His chest cavity was a hollowed-out cavern, his heart, somehow still beating faintly, clutched in his own hand, exposed to the frigid air, pulsing with a rhythm that was not his own, but a relentless, mechanical thrum. His lips were peeled back from his teeth, forming a silent, perpetual shriek, a mirror of the eternal scream that resonated not in their ears, but in the very core of their consciousness. The gas. It wasn't the stimulant that had kept them awake. It was a conduit. A gateway. The organism, as Volkov now thought of it, was not an external entity but an internalization of an awareness that had permeated the chamber, a consciousness so vast and indifferent it devoured all sleep, all dreams, all solace. It was the absolute, unfeeling gaze of existence itself, made manifest and inescapable. As the first soldiers, their faces pale with shock, entered the chamber, a collective gasp ripped through them. It wasn't just the sight, but the feeling. The cold that had permeated the chamber now pressed in on them, not as a physical chill, but as an invasive, psychic presence. It was the crushing weight of infinite, agonizing wakefulness, an echo of the torment that had consumed the men. They felt their own minds begin to fray, their identities threatened to unravel under the silent, burning scrutiny of those wide, unblinking eyes. Kuznetsov, a man who had seen countless atrocities, felt a terror unlike any he had ever known. This wasn't war, this was the undoing of reality. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this horror could not be allowed to escape. It could not even be known. The experiment had not merely failed, it had opened a door to a truth mankind was not meant to witness. "Burn it," he choked, his voice hoarse, his gaze fixed on the endless eyes of the damned. "Burn everything. The bodies. The chamber. The records. Everything." But the chamber, the entity, had already claimed its territory. Burning would not suffice. The evidence needed to be erased, absorbed, made to vanish without a trace. And the witnesses? The soldiers, the soldiers, frozen in a tableau of shared terror, found themselves trapped in the icy grip of the chamber's silent scream. The command to burn had barely left Kuznetsov's lips before the true nature of the horror asserted itself. This was not something that could be consumed by flame, it was a hunger, an emptiness, a void that had breached the wall of reality. The unblinking eyes of the subjects, no longer just a sight, became a presence, 1,000 needle points of conscious agony pressing into the minds of the living. Kuznetsov, his face a mask of grim determination, understood. Burning would scatter the ashes, but the essence, the malignant wakefulness, would linger, contaminating the very air, seeding nightmares in the soil. No, the evidence could not be destroyed, it had to be absorbed. And the witnesses? They were already tainted, their souls imprinted with the impossible truth. There was only one way to ensure silence, one way to truly seal the door that had been wrenched open. "Seal the outer door," Kuznetsov rasped, his voice devoid of all human warmth. The remaining guards, their faces pale and slick with frozen sweat, stared at him, bewildered. "Now. And every access point. We are burying this. All of it. All of us." A low moan escaped one of the younger men, a soldier barely out of boyhood. He scrambled back, tripping over a discarded piece of equipment, his eyes wide with dawning comprehension. Kuznetsov's gaze, now as dead and unwavering as those within the inner chamber, fixed on him. There was no mercy left, only the cold, calculating logic of containment. The clanging of the heavy outer door, usually a sound of security, now echoed like a death knell. The air grew heavier, not with smoke, but with an oppressive psychic weight, the pressure of countless unsleeping moments. The light flickered, then dimmed, as if the very power source recoiled from the consuming darkness within. The last of the soldiers, those who had sealed the final access, turned to face Kuznetsov, their expressions a mixture of fear and desperate plea. But Kuznetsov merely pointed towards the inner chamber, towards the pulsing, invisible heart of the nightmare. "We go in," he stated, his voice flat, final. "We become the last record. The final absorption." They did not resist. Perhaps the horror had already consumed their will, leaving only hollow husks. They walked, stumbling, into the spectral light of the observation room, their forms dissolving into the encroaching shadows. The walls of the chamber, once a barrier, now seemed porous, breathing, drawing them inwards. The last image recorded by the failing monitoring equipment was not of violence, but of a slow, inevitable fading. The men, Kuznetsov included, did not scream. They simply ceased to be distinct. Their outlines blurred, their forms thinned, like wisps of mist drawn into a boundless, silent vortex. The wide, Unblinking eyes of the original subjects seemed to grow, encompassing all, reflecting nothing. The cold chamber, deep beneath the frostbitten northern land, became a tomb not just for 5, but for all who had witnessed the experiment's horrific success. The building above collapsed inwards, not from explosion, but from an implosion of forgotten weight, a memory erased from the very stone. The land itself grew barren, eternally frozen, a scar on the earth. But sometimes, when the northern winds howl just so, travelers report a faint, high-pitched whisper carried on the blizzard, a sound like 1,000 minds trying to form a single thought, a wordless promise of eternal, agonizing wakefulness, stretching out from the buried depths, waiting. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of night, one might catch a glimpse, just at the edge of sight, of eyes that never blink, a presence that never sleeps, observing, absorbing, remembering. And you know, with a chilling certainty, that the experiment was not contained. It simply became boundless.